story is told about a little old man who arrived at the gates of heaven to meet St. Peter. I don't know why St. Peter always gets assigned to gate duty, but he does in all of these jokes. The little guy is expecting to be let right in, and St. Peter says, well, not so fast. He says, I know that you're kind of expecting as a believer, with grace and all, just to come right in. But he says, we're trying a new pilot program. And in the new pilot program, we've decided to try a merit-based system. And so I'm just wondering if you could give me maybe some good reasons why I should let you into heaven. The little guy's kind of taken aback. He wasn't expecting that, but he thinks about it, and he says, I can't really think of anything right off. And so Peter, trying to be helpful, he says, well, have you helped any little old ladies across the street recently? Guy says, I really can't. I've got a bad hip myself. Peter says, okay. He says, how about bowls of milk for a stray kitten? He says, I'm allergic to cats. I can't get near them. Peter says, okay. Did you show up for the church work day? Guy says, hey, remember the bad hip. I can't do that kind of thing. And Peter says, well, you got to help me out here. Have you got anything? So the guy thought, and he says, well, yeah, one time I saw this lady that was being harassed by these 5 big thugs. And they were trying to steal her purse from her, and there was nobody around. And so I knew it was up to me, and so I stepped between her and the thugs, and I took her purse back, and I said, if you want to steal this lady's purse, you're going to have to go through me. St. Peter says, wow. So that's pretty impressive. He goes, when did this happen? Guy said, about 5 minutes ago. Sometimes taking a stand can cost you. I have a friend who grew up in Cambodia, and as he became a young man, he began to study the Bible. And he came to a place where he put his faith in Jesus Christ. And his father, who was quite wealthy, owned a large jewelry business there in Cambodia, knew that his son was hanging around with Christians, knew that he was making a profession of faith, but he was willing to tolerate this until the day came that my friend got home and told his father that he had taken the step that day to be baptized. We've got some people being baptized after the second service. He'd taken that step. And in his father's mind, that was decisive. Because that said, this isn't just something you're toying with or thinking about, but you've taken a concrete step. You've made a stand to say that you are a follower of Jesus Christ. And that was not okay with his father. And he threw him out of the house. It was the middle of summer. It was incredibly hot there in Cambodia, all kinds of bugs. And for, I believe it was 3 weeks, he slept in a vehicle by the river with no place to live. All because he had taken a stand for his faith. The passage we want to look at this morning really has a lot to say about where do you stand and who are you standing with. If you've been following along as we've been studying the Gospel of John, you'll know that we've gotten up to John chapter 18. And here's a bit of interesting history. That right there is called the John Rylands fragment. It's dated from about, I think it's AD 110 to AD 125. It is the earliest existing piece of manuscript that we have for the New Testament. And it, interestingly, has John 18 on it. On one side, there are 17 words from John 18, verses 31 through 33. And the other side, there are 15 words from John 18, verses 37 through 38. Last week, we considered Jesus' prayer for his disciples in the upper room. Now, we get to chapter 18, we find that Jesus is going to lead them out to a familiar place. He says they went to a garden where he and his disciples entered. It was a place that they had frequented often. It was one of those favorite spots that they went to relax and to talk. And only tonight, rather than the garden being a place of respite and relaxation, it is going to be the launching point for a terrible whirlwind of activities that these disciples have no idea they are about to face. But Jesus knows. And knowing that, Jesus is the one who leads the way. At the same time that Jesus is leading his disciples to the garden, there is another disciple who is also leading a group to the garden. And it's Judas. You know the story. Judas has already sold Jesus out. He's agreed for 30 pieces of silver to take the authorities to a place where they can arrest Jesus in secret to avoid the crowds and the pressure. And so Judas is leading a group, an arresting party, to that garden. It's not a small party. It's a whole band of soldiers comprised of both the temple guards as well as a Roman cohort. The language that's used here in Greek indicates that there were Roman soldiers included with this. In fact, it's a Greek word speria, which means Latin cohort or a tenth of a legion, which could mean upwards of 600 soldiers. Now, probably there weren't 600 soldiers, but there was a pretty good contingent, and there was even a commander that was present with them. There were enough soldiers there to warrant a commander going along. Mark calls this a crowd that followed Judas. So you ask yourself, why so many? Why so many people to go out and make this arrest? Well, for one thing, I think the Jewish leaders wanted to make sure that there would be no resistance. You use overwhelming force to be sure that there is no resistance to what you're doing. I think they wanted the Roman soldiers there as well because they wanted the cover of Rome. They knew that Jesus had lots of popular support among the Jews. And they wanted, as we'll see as the story unfolds, they wanted to make Jesus' trial and execution really a Roman affair, that they could pass the blame. And maybe it was that these leaders wanted to make sure that there wasn't another failed arrest. You remember during the week prior, they'd already sent temple guards at one point to arrest Jesus. And instead of arresting him, they came back empty-handed and said, wow, nobody's ever taught the way this man teaches. And so perhaps on this night, as they're sending probably some of these same guards out again, they want to make sure there are some professional soldiers with them to be sure the job gets done. And so the two groups meet, and again we see Jesus taking the lead. Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." The first stand I'd like you to think about is the stand of Judas. It's interesting what John has to say about Judas. It says, Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. John is the only account that doesn't mention that infamous kiss of Judas to identify Jesus. John simply says that Judas was standing with them. It'd be amazing to know what was going through Judas's mind at this point. You just know the adrenaline had to be pumping. I mean, he recognizes that when he walks into that garden with all those soldiers, that the band of brothers who have been his closest friends for the last 3 years are going to know in that moment that he has sold them out. What did he feel as he looked at Jesus in the eye? The one that he had at one time called Lord and then had to openly acknowledge that he was turning his back on him. Not just turning his back on him, but actually giving him up to be arrested. I don't think that all the feelings were necessarily negative. I think there must have been a certain sense of relief in Judas's mind. Judas knew that the tension had been building. He knew that bad things were coming. And up to this point, he's been among those that were probably going to be on the short end of the stick when it all came down. There had to be a certain sense of relief that finally he wasn't the one who was in the crosshairs. Maybe there's a little bit of smugness. Maybe he felt like, he was the one who finally had seen through this whole thing. The rest of these guys maybe were still living under the illusion that Jesus was going to take them places and do things, but Judas was a little smarter than the rest of them. He could see what was coming, and he actually had struck a deal for himself. And he was probably the visionary in the group in his own mind. There had to be some sense of power to know that rather than being in the minority, he was now the one surrounded by power. In fact, he was the one, in one sense, directing the power, telling them where to go. I think we all want to be liked. In fact, we want to be liked by the majority. Very few people, by default, do not want to have most people like them. We want to be liked by powerful people. We want to be liked by popular people. We want to be liked. Back in the 1970s, maybe you remember a political organization that was formed that was called the Moral Majority. Remember the Moral Majority? There were a lot of folks, a lot of Christians that were concerned because they saw our country in this rapid decline and turning away from traditional Judeo-Christian ethics. And yet there was an argument that said that really underneath it all, a majority of Americans, those silent, still believed in those traditional ethics, that right was right and wrong was wrong. And I think a lot of Christians found great comfort in this idea that the hostility to things that we believed in was really only superficial. That if you really dug under the surface, you'd find that we actually were in the majority, and most people thought like we thought, and most people liked us for what we believed. I mean, who wants to be part of the moral minority? Who wants to be a loner? Who wants to be a loser? It made us feel better to think that maybe we were a majority. Judas certainly didn't want to be the moral minority. It had to feel good to him to be standing with the hundreds rather than huddled with the dozen. But if Judas felt at all smug, his confidence, I think, was quickly shaken. Part of the point in presenting an overwhelming force is the shock and awe that it should generate in the person who is being surrounded, being attacked, if you will. And there was shock and awe that night for sure, but it wasn't exactly the kind that Judas had anticipated. We find instead that it was Jesus who took charge. Jesus, knowing all that would happen, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And the result? When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. What's going on? Well, John has emphasized all through his account that it's Jesus who sets the pace. Jesus knows what is coming. Jesus leads them to the garden. When the arresting party comes, it's Jesus that steps forward and actually initiates the conversation. What John wants us to see is that Jesus is not a victim of history. He's not just a good man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He is, in fact, the author of history, who, in conjunction with his Father, has chosen the time and the place of this confrontation. He is leading in it. Back in John chapter 10, verse 18, Jesus uttered these words. He said, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again." Speaking of his life. Here's my take on what I think happened with those temple guards. The temple guards of this group, the Romans and the Jewish temple guards, I think the temple guards are at the front. We know that Malchus, who was the high priest's servant, he is definitely right at the front, one of those that was going to make the arrest. And it only makes sense that the rest of the temple guard was right there behind him. The Romans, I think, are securing the perimeter. They're making sure that none of these guards turn tail and fail like they did last time. And they're making sure that Jesus doesn't get away. And so they're keeping the perimeter. And these guys who are standing there, the temple guards, are first and foremost religious students. They were part of the temple culture. They had been drafted, if you will, to guard duty, but first and foremost, they were students of scriptures. They had heard Jesus teaching the temple. Some of these were no doubt those who had been amazed the first time they heard him and couldn't even get him arrested because they were so impressed with his teaching. These guys also knew full well the miraculous power that Jesus had displayed. They had heard about him restoring hearing to deaf people, restoring sight to the blind. And certainly just a few days prior, because it was the talk of the town, they'd heard that he had raised a man. He had raised Lazarus from the dead. And these were just men. They were as moved as anyone was by the amazing things they had heard, the power they had heard that Jesus had. And so it had to be going through their mind, what kind of miracle act could a man like that be capable of if his life was on the line? They knew that Jesus had also made these provocative statements that seemed to link his authority to that of Yahweh himself, the God of the covenant. The one true God who identified himself to their great leader Moses long, long ago as simply the I am. And Jesus seemed to use that little loaded phrase, I am, often in reference to himself. To their Jewish ears, they were tuned to that kind of language, and it bothered them. It unsettled them. And I suspect that some of them were being swayed in their own hearts. They were beginning to think that there really was something to this man Jesus. Not only are their emotions and their ears on high alert as they step into that garden, but there's something else at work as well. Because God's Holy Spirit is in that place. The triune God is intently focused on what is happening in that garden. It is the climax of the plan that was set in motion from eternity past. And they're walking to a place where God's presence, I think, is practically crackling in the air. The little neck hairs on several hundred necks are tingling and dancing in that flickering torchlight. And suddenly, there's Jesus. Not hiding, not avoiding them, not running away, but walking right at them. Let me give you a tip. If you get stopped by an officer, one thing you don't want to do is jump out of your car and walk toward him. Okay? That's going to alarm everybody. For these guys show up to arrest someone, the man they came to arrest that they're trying to impress with all their power doesn't seem to be at all impressed. In fact, he walks straight to them and starts asking questions. And the first question he asks is, who are you looking for? And they had to be thinking, well, wait a minute, who's in charge here? We're the ones doing the arresting. And then Jesus says, I am. They said, we're looking for Jesus. And he says back to them, I am. Again, it's that equivalent of Yahweh, God's holy name. And at that point, with this man walking toward them with all of the background they had, with the fears and the concerns they had, and suddenly that statement is uttered, I think all the guys at the front suddenly want to be at the back. And chaos ensues, and everybody falls down. You have to picture this pile of panicked policemen who are trying to untangle themselves from this. I don't think Jesus waited for them to get up before he asked again, who do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I am he. I have a hunch if the Roman cohort hadn't been holding the perimeter, those temple guards would have just been out of there. Jesus, right away, takes charge of the arrest. He says, I told you I'm he, so if you seek me, let these men go. Since when do the guys being arrested set the terms of the arrest? But that's what Jesus does. John says this was to fulfill the word that he'd spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. It was just part of fulfilling those words. It was a small start, if you will, because a far greater saving work was being accomplished. Well, then the second stand happens. This time it is Peter. The temple guards are not the only ones whose hearts are beating fast and their minds are a whirl. Peter's watching all of this, and Peter is mad. I mean, he's shocked. He's shocked to realize that Judas has sold them out. He's enraged that his beloved master is being taken by this mob, a mob that represents on one hand the great hypocrites of the Jewish leaders who had been their enemies for a long time, and on the other hand, the hated Romans that the Jews so desperately wanted to be free of. And here they both are, arresting the man that he loves and respects and reveres more than any other. Peter's already been amped up because he's heard Jesus talking about persecution that's going to come. And he's already told Jesus that he would gladly stand with him. He would die for him. And that promise has to still be burning in Peter's heart. And suddenly, Peter sees opportunity. The problem is, Peter is not Zorro. He takes a swing, he misses, and he cuts off an ear. You know, if there was miracle power at work in the guards, I think there was at least as much power at work that kept Peter from being run through by one of them. But Jesus puts a stop to Peter's actions. He says, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink from the cup the Father has given me?" And suddenly, Peter is at a loss. If he can't fight and die, what is left to do? And where there was anger and bravado, now there's only confusion. Mark records what happens next. They all left him and fled. Peter is at a loss. The scene ends with Jesus being bound and led away. There's irony in this. Philip Comfort and Wendell Hawley note this. They carried torches to search for the light of the world. They were armed with swords and clubs and robe to subdue the Prince of Peace. Well, Jesus first is taken to Annas. Annas was at one time the high priest. He'd been the high priest from AD 6 to 15. That office rotated, and at the time of Jesus' arrest, it was actually Caiaphas, who was a son-in-law. But once you'd been high priest, you kind of kept this emeritus status. And Annas therefore retained much of his power and prestige. And it's interesting the questions that Annas has for Jesus. He wanted to know about his disciples and his teaching. I actually think of those, his disciples, his followers, was of most interest to Annas, because this was really a political calculation. The question is, Jesus, how much power do you have? How big is your following? How much of a threat are you to our power? That was the one question Jesus ignored. His intent was to protect his disciples, not to surrender them. And his real power had nothing to do with numbers. The only question that he responds to is in regards to his teaching. And even then, he doesn't really answer. He says, "I've never taught in secret. You can ask anyone who's heard me, they'll tell you what I've said." You can't interrogate the person who is being prosecuted. You need to get some witnesses here. Well, his refusal to answer gets him a slap in the face. Being humble doesn't mean you don't stand up for what is right. He says, "If I've said something wrong, tell me what it is." Edward Klink, commenting on this, says that the reader knows full well that the question should be immediately reversed and asked of the servant, "Is that how you treat the true high priest?" The only one who's out of line here is the appointed high priest of the Jews. Well, we come to stand number 3, and that is Peter again, but this time it's Peter standing out in the courtyard. John does something interesting. All of the gospel writers recount Peter being there in the courtyard. It's where his denial of Christ happens, right? But all the other 3 gospels all treat that as a single block. All right, they just tell the story of Peter in the courtyard and his denial of Jesus. John does something different. John switches the scene back and forth between John in the courtyard and Jesus before the high priest. I suggested early on in the series that I think John would have made a great photographer, because he chooses his subjects and he frames them to show off the truths that he wants us to see. I think John would have been a good videographer as well. He edits the scene for maximum power. If you're watching a movie and they keep alternating, cutting back and forth between 2 different characters in 2 different places, what do you realize? They want you to see that there's some kind of a contrast or some kind of connection between these 2 characters and what's going on. And John shows us on one hand Jesus, who is standing alone facing the powerful, and Peter, who is standing with a whole bunch of people out in the courtyard, but afraid. John 18:18. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Peter now was standing among the same group that Judas had stood with earlier. Judas stood with him as a traitor. Peter is not a traitor, but he is afraid. He knows that being a friend of Jesus is not going to earn any points in this place, any more than wearing an I Love Barbecue t-shirt to a vegan picnic will win you friends. He's also assaulted one of their own. Lucky for him, it was a time before camera phones, so nobody had a good picture of who that guy was out there in the dark that hit the other guy. But we know that's part of what's troubling Peter as he stands there, because John points it out. He says, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" He's not sure, but he's thinking, aren't you the guy? And Peter's thinking, this is not going to go well if they figure out that I was the guy with the sword there in the garden hitting people. By the way, Peter got into that courtyard with the help of another mystery disciple. It says that there was another disciple, and that disciple was known to the high priest. If you read this account, you might wonder, who is that? I think it's John himself, because we see this in other places where John never refers to himself by name. He always uses these oblique references. He also seems to demonstrate some personal knowledge of the household of the high priest. It says the high priest knew this disciple. We don't know how they knew each other. Judea, though, wasn't that big a place, so they apparently had some connection. And John alone among the Gospels actually gives us the name of the high priest's servant. He actually knows this guy's name. In fact, he is also the one who identifies that one of the people who questioned Peter was a relative of his servant. So to me it says that the writer of this gospel did have that kind of firsthand knowledge. So John must have been there as well. Peter's denial is well known, not because he was a traitor, but because he was a coward. It's interesting, Jesus earlier had pronounced over Peter, when Peter proclaimed him Lord. He said, "Peter, on this rock I will build my church." In fact, he named him Peter. He named him a rock. And yet Jesus knew who Peter was. He knew that Peter had both great passion and great desire, but that Peter could also be flighty. And he knew that in this moment, he knew that Peter was going to fail, that he was going to fall down. I think it's interesting that Jesus still chose Peter. Jesus loved Peter. That's kind of encouraging to me, because sometimes I fall down badly. Maybe you do too. And to know that God chooses people that he knows at times will fall down. Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians. He says, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." Peter was convinced that he was a pretty strong guy. Jesus knew better. He said, "Peter, you're a jar of clay. You are going to fall down, but I still love you. I still have a purpose for you." The contrast that we see through this all is that Jesus is the one who stands out. He is the one who stands alone facing the power figures. Judas goes with the crowd as a traitor. Peter falls in with the crowd as a coward. D.A. Carson says that Jesus stands up to his questioners and denies nothing, while Peter cowers before his questioners and denies everything. But you see, there's grace even in that. Jesus had told Peter before he ever failed that he was going to fall. And yet, even in that moment, Jesus was protecting Peter. Jesus refused to give Peter up to his interrogators. He said, "Arrest me and let these men go." Well, the story moves on to Jesus being taken to stand before Governor Pilate. Dawn is breaking as they take Jesus to him. It's interesting that it was quite common for Roman officials to begin their workday at dawn and then be done by 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. That was not unusual. It would appear that there had been some backroom dealing going on, and the Jewish leaders were convinced that all they had to do was hand Jesus over to Pilate. The fix was already in. He'd be convicted. They'd be done with it. These two groups both needed each other, the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders, and they also loathed each other. The Jews want to use Pilate to execute Jesus. Pilate ultimately is going to appease them, but not without making them sweat. And so we find Pilate's questioning of Jesus. He called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That is the charge that the Jewish leaders are bringing. And of course, for them, they feel that this is going to be a sufficient charge to get Jesus executed. This is a charge of sedition. You are setting yourself up as an alternate king to Rome. and Rome does not like alternate kings. And so Pilate comes in to say, is that true? Is that true, Jesus? What are your political aspirations? What is your power base that you're claiming for yourself? Are you a threat to my domain? And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate, I'm really no threat to you, at least not in the way that you're worried about. My supporters are not going to be going into the streets with pitchforks and Molotov cocktails to set me free. That's not what my kingdom is about. So Pilate comes back. He says, well, then you are a king. You're a king of some sort, right? And you're saying that my kingdom isn't of this world, so that must mean that you are a king of something. What are you a king of? Jesus, I want to hear these words from you. I want to hear you say, I'm a king, because I have to find you guilty of this crime. So would you please just say those words? What is it you're a king of? Jesus replies with a rather evasive and shrewd response. He says, well, you say I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Pilate, the only one talking about kings around here is you. If you want to call me a king, go ahead, call me a king. I'm not denying it, but I'm not going to say it either. You're going to be forced to condemn me for something other than treason and sedition. Pilate, here's what I'm really concerned about. Not staking out a political position, but proclaiming the deepest truths about life. Why don't you ask me about that, Pilate? That would be a different conversation for us to have. Pilate's response is dismissive and cynical. What is truth? With a wave of a hand, he pushes Jesus aside. I have a feeling that the wave of the hand probably was to cover up a little more discomfort in his soul than he wanted to admit. This man that seemed to have no fear of him, that would look him right in the eye, that understood the game and wasn't going to play the game with him, and is talking about truth in a way that is unsettling. And Pilate doesn't want to go any farther with this conversation. And in his calculating political mind, he's saying to himself, you know, Jesus, I find you fascinating. I don't think you're a threat the way these pompous leaders would like to portray you. But at the end of the day, Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, this whole thing is nothing but a big game. And you're a nice guy, but I don't think you know how to play the game very well. You don't know how to play with the big boys, and this is going to go badly for you. Well, you know how it ends. Pilate lets the Jews know that he doesn't find any reason to put Jesus to death. And he has a little fun. We'll see this next week as well. He has a little fun digging at them with that title, King of the Jews. He keeps insisting on calling Jesus the King of the Jews. He offers them a way out. In Pilate's mind, we're at a bit of an impasse here. I don't think this guy's guilty. He hasn't said the magic phrase you wanted him to say that I can condemn him for. How about we strike a little deal? We've got some tradition going here where I set someone free on the Passover. How about if you guys just take that option, and that will look good. You'll look really merciful. You will have scared this poor man to death, and we can all move on. What do you think of that for a deal? They refuse. They say, we'd rather have Barabbas. We'd rather have a robber released to us than to have Jesus released. And with that, Jesus' fate is sealed. We'll look at that more next week. As I was reading this past week, a number of different commentators, all of them talked about the ironies that they saw in this story. And I thought I would just share some of these with you, because this story is rife with irony. Edward Klink, Pilate's question, what is truth, is addressed to the very one who was the truth. D.A. Carson, the Jews take elaborate precautions to avoid ritual contamination in order to eat Passover. They wouldn't go into Pilate's courtroom. But at the very same time, they're busy manipulating the judicial system to secure the death of him who alone is the true Passover. Ramsey Michaels. Ironically, those who at the beginning of the narrative refused to even enter the Roman praetorium for fear of ritual defilement, in the end cry out, "We have no king but Caesar." Philip Comfort, Wendell Hawley. They wanted to give life to a murderer and murder the one who would come to give them life. We are honoring our seniors this Sunday that are graduating from high school. As I've thought about them, there'll be a group in the second service, but I thought, they are about to enter this world of secular academia for many of them, where the crowd will often seem to display a hatred for Jesus. They don't really understand Jesus, but they see him and those who follow him as being a threat. That's nothing new. Jesus told his disciples right at the outset, the world will hate you because of me. That's not something new in the 21st century. That's not just because of the decline of Christianity in America. That has been true from the very beginning, that to be a follower of Jesus, to love him, will put us at odds with the system, will get us hated at times. And it can be intimidating. When you're in those situations where you're the minority, and your faith, your love for Christ is not respected. In fact, it's seen as a threat. It's intimidating. And there can be the Judas temptation to turn our backs on Jesus and bury our faith, and in doing that, gain the approval of the crowd. There can be the Peter temptation to hold on to our faith, but to keep it under wraps, keep it out of sight, and so effectively become a reluctant part of the crowd. But you see, the battle is not about politics. It's about truth. Pilate wanted to make this a political battle. What are you the king of? And Jesus says, what I want to talk to you about, what is true? What is true about the human heart? What is true about God? What is true about right and wrong? What is true about what I have come to do? What is truth? We encounter powerful people with big degrees who, like Pilate, will attempt to dismiss Jesus with a wave of the hand and a roll of their eyes and a flippant statement like, what is truth? How can you know what truth is? How dare you even suggest that you have some kind of a corner on truth? And the implications will be that smart people, educated people, rational people know better than to put their faith in and orient their life around Jesus. I don't know what your experience is. Most of us here, we don't have the seniors in this service, but as older adults, I think there are a lot of older adults that struggle with their secret doubts. I know that experience, to be an adult and go through doubt. And we kind of wonder ourselves, do smart people actually have faith? Am I just kind of deluding myself? Is there really a good reason to put my faith in Jesus? And I just want to assure you that while academic accomplishments don't prove anything, there are plenty of very accomplished academic men and women who are solid critical thinkers, who are also dedicated followers of Jesus Christ. Belief does not mean being stupid. Far from it. John Lennox is a distinguished professor of mathematics at Oxford University, and he's a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ. Rosario Butterfield is a tenured professor of English at Syracuse University, a one-time atheist and a lesbian activist. She's now a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ. John Polkinghorne is a respected theoretical physicist who's a follower of Jesus Christ. Francis Collins led the Human Genome Project, and he's a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ. Alvin Plantinga is a renowned analytic philosopher and a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ. Dallas Willard was a longtime professor of philosophy at University of Southern California in Los Angeles and was a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ. James Tour is a synthetic organic chemist that specializes in nanotechnology, named as one of the 50 most influential scientists in the world today. And he's a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ. There are great thinkers that have wrestled with and thought well about the questions and challenges that are presented to faith. And whether you are young and you're facing the secular world of college, or whether you're an older adult and you've just got these things you've never chased to the ground and thought through, there are great thinkers who love Jesus, who have thought well about these issues, and would say there are good reasons to be a follower, to believe Jesus. I would challenge you that if those things are still true for you that you're wrestling with, talk to myself, talk to some of the other pastors. We'll give you resources. There is good material to read and interact with to help answer questions so that you can feel confident in standing for your faith. Every one of us has to make a decision as to where we stand and who we stand with. Judas made his decision. Peter vacillated because fear got the better of him. In it all, Jesus loved them. He stood out and he stood alone to rescue them, to save them. And the thing he asks us to do is to follow him and to stand for him. Amen?